Hey guys, gonna go over section 4 of our packet and finish that up, even though I published the PowerPoints. So I'm gonna start off, it's titled A Flawed Peace, and it starts off talking about how in January of 1919 that a conference formed at the Palace of Versailles, which is just a little bit outside of Paris, and that there were delegates from over 32 countries, and they were debating the terms of peace, and it was quite a long process. As the Allies came together, there were many leaders present, but there were just a couple of men that dominated this group, and those leaders became known as the Big Four. And so from the United States, we had Woodrow Wilson. From France, we had Georges Clemenceau. From Great Britain, we had Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And then from Italy, we had the Premier Vittorio Orlando. So, what exactly was Wilson's plan for peace? So, Woodrow Wilson came up with what became famously known as the 14 points, which was an outline that he believed would bring a lasting world peace. Now, next year, when you get into U.S. history, you'll go over all 14 parts of that plan. For our purposes in world history, we are just going to look at the highlights. So, first of all, he called for what became known as free trade and freedom of the seas. And he also wanted to put an end to secret alliances and military buildups. So he's trying to do that to kind of lessen some of those causes that we started off this unit with when we were talking about that acronym of MAIN, eliminating militarism, eliminating alliances, and then eliminating imperialism. He also wanted to promote what became known as self-determination, which is the right for people to govern their own nation. He also envisioned this international peacekeeping body that would try to settle disputes, and that famously would be given the name the League of Nations. So, what about this Versailles Treaty? First of all, Great Britain and France, their main goal was to punish Germany. And so the Allies are going to force Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919. Although they created the League of Nations, this international organization to keep peace, they also blamed Germany for the war, and they are going to force them to pay damages to a couple of different nations. Those famously became known as reparations, which were 132 billion gold marks, which equates to about 33 billion US dollars. So each of the central powers is going to be given a separate treaty with punishments. In addition to this, they are going to make the Germans say that it was their fault for causing World War I, and that became known famously as the War Guilt Clause of the Treaty of Versailles. Excuse me. So the League of Nations would end up ruling the German colonies until they kind of felt that those colonies were ready for independence, which doesn't happen until well after World War II. And they famously became known as mandates. And so those mandates mostly were former German colonies and colonies of the Ottoman Empire. So why was the Treaty of Versailles considered a troubled treaty? Because it is going to be one of the leading causes of World War II. So first of all, you have a number of bullets there on your packet. Versailles dramatically changed the map of Europe. And that is going to be a major change. You're going to notice that if you compare the map of Europe from 1914 to 1918, it looks completely different. So the major empires of Austria-Hungary and Russia and Germany and the Ottoman Empire, they're going to have their land greatly reduced. The Ottoman Empire from now on will be referred to as Turkey, and most of their Middle Eastern lands are going to be mandates of Great Britain and France. Again, later that's going to be a big deal because a lot of those Middle Eastern countries after World War II, they're going to want control of those lands because of the oil. In addition, there are going to be a number of new countries formed, countries like Yugoslavia on the Balkan Peninsula, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and we'll see the reemergence of Poland on the map. Poland had not been on the map of Europe since the partition in 1795. So this is a peace treaty that they say was built on quicksand. All right. So first of all, the Germans ended up hating the French and the British because of the peace treaty. Secondly, the United States never joined the League of Nations, so it made the League of Nations very weak. And thirdly, many countries started developing what became known as an isolationist policy, where they weren't going to get involved with other countries. Many Americans opposed the League of Nations. They didn't want anything to do with Europe. There also were many former colonies that were angry. They wanted their independence. One example of that was the colony of Vietnam. It was a French colony, and a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh wanted independence, and he was ignored by the Big Four. That later ends up really hurting the West because Ho Chi Minh will gravitate more toward communism. And so later we'll have a civil war that takes place in Vietnam, and then eventually the Vietnam War ends up being like a 20-year saga. So we'll talk about that probably later in April. And then lastly, Japan and Italy criticized the agreement because they both thought that they were going to get more land as a result of being on the Allied side. We're going to finish up with this half page here. I again apologize for this packet not being stapled as best as it could have been. On that last page, in addition to some of those other issues that I've talked about, Russia in 1917 is going to first go through a revolution where the Tsar Nicholas II, will abdicate his throne. He will be the last of the Romanov leaders. And then after that, they will get involved in a brutal civil war that finally ends in 1922. The Bolsheviks, yes, the Bolsheviks, will take control of Russia's government led by Vladimir Lenin. We will cover that in our next unit. And then Russia signs a treaty with Germany in March of 1918 and pulls out of the war. Why is that peace treaty so significant? It's significant because Germany could concentrate on the Western Front, and they didn't have to fight a two-front war anymore. The Central Powers finally collapsed. Germany was attempting to focus on the Western Front, but with the United States coming in, it boosted the morale of the Allies, and they were able to fight the Germans off. And with that happening, there were riots and revolts all throughout Germany, and Kaiser Wilhelm had to flee. He had to leave. With that in mind, the Allies won the war. An armistice was signed, which ended fighting, and it was signed on November 11th of 1918 at 11 a.m. That is the third date that you will need to know from World War I. So we already talked about June 28th, 1914, the day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. And then July 28th, 1914 was the start of World War I. And then you'll need to know November 11th, 1918, the end of World War I. So what was the legacy of World War I? The war did take a heavy toll, with 8 to 10 million soldiers killed, the most in history up to that point. There were another 20 million wounded. The war devastated the European economy and drained national treasuries. There were many acres of land and homes and villages and towns destroyed. And unfortunately, survivors suffered what was known as disillusionment and despair. And that is reflected in a lot of the art and literature movements of the 1920s that famously became known as the Lost Generation. Art movements like Surrealism, with famous artists like Salvador Dali, and other movements such as the Dada movement and Cubism and abstract art. So we'll later talk about Pablo Picasso and some of our famous writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald with The Great Gatsby and Ernest Hemingway with a famous book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and many others. So that kind of ends our little review packet. We'll be doing a little focusing on weapons and battles and get a little bit more into the peace treaty over the next few days before we test. Thank you.